Hey guys, tonight we wander the warm, amber-lit streets of early 20th century Cairo, where the scent of dust and jasmine hovers low and old stories still breathe through open windows. You're just a shadow among many dodging donkey carts and piles of spice sacks squinting at the flicker of gas lamps that blink to life like tired eyes. It's that hour when the sun has just dipped, but the city hasn't quite let go. Vendors pack up dates and almonds. The last newspaper boy shouts headlines you'll never read. You sidestep a sleeping cat that might be sacred or just lazy, hard to tell. And yet, despite all the city's chaos, you're not here for the clamor. You're here for something quieter, something deeper. You follow the footsteps of others heading in the same direction. Their slippers shuffle dust into soft clouds that catch the street lamp glow. There's a hush, not of silence, but of anticipation. You probably won't survive this being the idea of life without streaming smartphones or even a radio. How did people unwind back then? They listened, really listened. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You cross a quiet street as a flickering gaslight sputters above. The cafe ahead glows with a low golden hue, glassless windows, embroidered curtains dancing in the warm breeze. It's a Baladi cafe, the kind that doesn't care for polished wood or fancy tea leaves. Just small tables, tin cups, and chairs that all seem to lean slightly to one side. A man in a long galabeah steps aside to let you pass. The door creaks, of course it creaks, and inside you feel that invisible change in air pressure that tells you 100 eyes just noticed you, and immediately forgot you, because you're not the reason they're here. You slide onto a stool. The legs are uneven. That's fine. A waiter who looks like he's been here since the pyramids brings you sweet tea in a cloudy glass. The sugar sits proudly at the bottom like it paid for the drink itself. You stir it with a spoon that rings like a bell ding and then fades into the murmurs of the crowd. There are no speakers, no mic, just a space near the front, a slightly raised platform with one chair. One man will sit there, one man will speak, and somehow he'll fill the room. This is the time of the Hakawati, the storyteller. Not some costumed actor, not a tour guide. A real weaver of tales. His only tools: voice, gesture, silence. He hasn't arrived yet, but the murmurs are growing. People are talking, yes, but it's the kind of talking that tests the air, measuring how close they are to silence. Even the charcoal brazier near the door seems to quiet down. You glance around. Across the room, two teenage boys pretend not to look excited. A woman in her 40s, veiled, elegant, sips her tea without taking her eyes off the empty chair. The Hakawati enters without fanfare. One moment he's not there, the next he is. His robe is simple, his beard gray, his eyes sharp, and he carries a walking stick not for walking, but for pointing. He sits. The crowd hushes like it owes him money. And then without a single once upon a time, he begins. You don't realize you're leaning forward until your back starts to ache. His voice is low, not quiet, just deep, pulling you toward it. You don't catch every word, you don't need to. His tone does the lifting, each phrase a thread, each silence a knot. You're being wrapped in something before you even know what it is. He tells of a desert fox who outwits a merchant, of a caravan lost for 40 nights, of a prince who dreams of death and wakes with laughter. These stories shimmer not just in your mind, but in the eyes around you. They know them already, and yet they listen like it's the first time. Here's your historical fact. At the turn of the 20th century, oral storytelling in Egypt wasn't quaint. It was essential. Literacy was still low, especially in rural areas, and the Hakawati served as newspaper, novel, and Netflix combined. Here's your fringe detail. Some storytellers were so beloved that people paid them in dried apricot socks or even matchmaking favors. One famous Hakawati supposedly received a camel just for changing the ending of a tale to spare a local merchant's pride. And historians still argue whether the most popular Hakawatis were political agents in disguise delivering resistance and critique through allegory to avoid colonial censorship. Back in your chair, you hear a creak behind you. Someone's adjusting to a better view. No one moves too loudly. No one checks a phone. You sip your tea. Still too sweet. Still perfect. Outside, the city pulses on carriages, bells, stray dogs. But inside, the only thing that matters is what happens next. The air inside the tea house hums gently, steadily as the storyteller's words knit themselves into the room's silence. Outside, Cairo may be creaking into a modern century, but in here, time has politely excused itself. You shift your weight, trying not to squeak the stool. The crowd has grown, and there's a soft rustle as someone passes around a worn tin tray of roasted chickpeas, the kind that always gets stuck in your teeth. A boy slides in next to you, barefoot, maybe 9. He's not drinking tea, he's drinking story. His eyes don't blink when the Hakawati lifts a hand or when the voice dips low enough that you have to lean in to catch it. The storyteller's lips barely move, but the room listens like he's shouting. He's recounting a parable or maybe a confession. It's unclear where truth ends and metaphor begins. That's part of the charm. Tonight's tale is old, ancient even, but it's being told with fresh breath. A clever merchant seeks to win the heart of a wealthy widow using only riddles, a badly behaved parrot, and a bag of counterfeit spices. Everyone knows this story. You know this story. But it's not just the story, is it? It's the delivery. Watch him. See how he pauses before the punchline, how his fingers tap the edge of his chair like he's striking a match. That's not accidental. That's years of practice. The Hakawati's craft isn't recitation. It's invocation. He doesn't simply tell the tale, he calls it down into the room like a djinn and lets it hover between you all until it finds a place to land. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In early 20th century Egypt, especially in cities like Cairo and Alexandria, professional storytellers were fixtures of popular culture. Many were semi-illiterate or fully illiterate, but carried entire epics in memory, such as the legendary Sirat Antar or Abu Zaid al-Hilali. Some performances could last hours, others spanned multiple nights. As the parrot in the story reveals the merchant's lies in hilarious detail, mimicking his master's voice, no less, the audience erupts in knowing laughter. It's the kind of laugh people share when they've heard something scandalous, but not too scandalous. The boy beside you clutches his sides. Someone coughs loudly near the hookah corner, whether from smoke or amusement, you can't tell. You glance toward the back of the cafe where the real whispers live. That's where the old men sit, wrapped in scarves, eyes half-lidded, not because they're sleepy, but because they know how it ends. Still they come. Why? Because sometimes it's not about surprise, it's about return. You've returned too, in a way, not just to this chair or this night, but to something deeper, a need to be wrapped in words, to be pulled gently from yourself and handed back a little softer. In the back, a waiter spills tea. No one scolds him. No one even looks. Everyone's eyes are fixed on the storyteller's hands, now raised, now slicing sideways through the air to emphasize a sudden betrayal in the tale. The parrot has just flown away, apparently offended, and the merchant has nothing left but shame and a fake bag of cardamom. The widow, of course, sees through everything and tells him he's free to leave, with his dignity scattered like cumin seeds on the wind. A round of delighted clucks rolls through the crowd. Even the stern-faced man with the newspaper cracks a smirk. And now here's your quirky tidbit. Some Egyptian storytellers use sound props to punctuate certain lines. A snapped wooden spoon, a string of pebbles in a tin, even an old copper bell, all tools to make a moment pop. One famed Hakawati used an actual goose feather to tickle nearby listeners during romantic scenes. Yes, really. The storyteller tonight has no feathers, just control. He lowers his voice, and you feel the shift before the words even reach you. This next part isn't funny. This is the lesson, the moment of quiet realization. The merchant broke and broken stares into the Nile, and in the stillness we're reminded that wisdom doesn't come from tricks, but from truth and the willingness to be seen. You could almost hear the river, if not for the kettle hissing in the corner. And now comes the nod, the knowing one. You've seen it all night. Listeners leaning back, tea, forgotten eyelids drooping not from boredom, but from that dreamy state stories bring. And yet here's a gentle academic squabble. Historians still argue whether storytellers like this had real influence over public opinion or were merely entertainers. Some scholars insist that their tales shaped attitudes toward colonization, class, and even women's rights. Others argue they were the Netflix of their time, enjoyed then forgotten. No consensus yet. But you know what you feel right now, and it isn't forgettable. A gust of warm wind rolls through the open windows. The curtains sway like they've heard the ending before, too. The Hakawati finishes with a bow of the head, not for applause, but as if thanking the story itself for visiting tonight. Silence. Then tea slurps. Muted murmurs, a joke retold in a quieter corner, but no one claps. That's not how this works. You don't applaud a friend for reminding you of who you are. You take one more sip now, lukewarm now, just right. And you wait because you know he's not done yet. You barely notice when the next story begins. The Hakawati shifts in his seat, sips from a chipped glass, and returns not with a bang but a whisper that somehow hushes the whole room. This one's different. No cheeky parrots or foolish merchants tonight. No disguises or mistaken identities. At least not yet. Instead, he begins with something simple. A boy walks into the desert and finds a lion asleep. That's all it takes. The cafe leans in. You lean in. The boy in the story isn't named. Not yet. He could be anyone. He could be you if you squint a little. He carries nothing but a stick and a question. What kind of question? That's the trick. You don't know yet. The storyteller's voice is softer now, more careful. The laughter from the last tale still lingers faintly in the corners, like a scent someone forgot to wash off. But this new mood pulls the light in tighter, like a shawl around the night's shoulders. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Before radios made their way into most Egyptian homes in the 1930s, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was the default evening activity in both rural and urban spaces. Even after long days of work, people craved a return to the familiar cadence of oral tales. Cafes were cultural sanctuaries where stories filled the role that soap operas and streaming series now occupy. As the nameless boy in the story approaches the sleeping lion, the cafe itself seems to hold its breath. A dog outside lets out a bark, then falls silent as if embarrassed to interrupt. You glance around and notice something strange. Half the people in here have heard this story before, but their eyes say they haven't. That's the real magic. Because what you're hearing isn't the same as last time. It's being retold, reshaped, redreamed in real time. The boy's stick becomes a flute, then a snake, then a walking cane. The lion speaks, but not with words, with a gesture, and somehow you understand. The cafe is a sea of stillness. The only movement is the gentle curl of steam from the hookah pipes and the quiet blinking of a tired man at the back, who might be asleep or simply enchanted. A woman near the window murmurs a line along with the storyteller. She's heard this tale since she was a girl. Her fingers move in time with the story's rhythm, tracing patterns in spilled sugar on the table. It's not just nostalgia, it's ritual. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt and the Delta, grandmothers were known to host mini majlis storytelling circles in the evenings, passing down tales of spirits, cursed wells, and miraculous donkeys to wide-eyed grandchildren. These tales often made their way into public storytelling cafes, where they evolved and adapted for larger audiences. The boy and the lion now walk together. Yes, walk, like old friends heading nowhere in particular, but each step seems heavier. There's a shadow following them, a doubt, a memory, or maybe just the weight of growing up. The story dips briefly into darkness. The lion grows old. The boy becomes a man. Their journey ends at a village that no longer remembers stories, only silence, taxes, and British boots. A whisper passes through the cafe, an old man muttering something about 1999, another about lost fathers. You don't know the reference exactly, but you feel the weight. And here comes your scholarly scuffle. Historians still argue whether these emotionally loaded stories, ones that shifted from the mystical to the political, were spontaneous reflections of the times or cleverly constructed resistance tales. Were storytellers merely catching the mood or shaping it? You'll never know. That's part of the spell. Back in the cafe, the Hakawati lets the ending dangle. The lion disappears into the dunes. The boy stays behind, planting something small in the sand. A memory, maybe, or a story seed waiting for the next listener to make it bloom. There's no moral, no lesson pinned down like a specimen, just a long breath and the unspoken agreement that some stories aren't for understanding, they're for carrying. The crowd stirs gently. A few chuckles from a side table try to shake off the weight, but they don't quite succeed. You stretch your legs beneath the table, knocking into something soft. It's the boy from earlier, curled up now, head on the floor, using his rolled-up galabea as a pillow. His chest rises slowly. His dreams are already miles into the desert. You sip your tea, cold but still sweet. And just then someone starts clapping. Not loudly, not officially, just a few claps from a young woman in the back, like she couldn't help it. She blushes. The Hakawati smiles briefly, then silence again, the kind that says, "We're not done yet." The Hakawati leans forward now, resting both elbows on his knees. He doesn't speak right away. He lets the silence linger, lets it grow a spine and stretch its legs. And when he finally opens his mouth, the first word drops like a pebble into a still pond. There was a thief who only stole on Thursdays. The audience is instantly lighter. The emotional fog from the last story lifts like incense in a cross breeze. Someone in the back lets out a knowing chuckle. You get the sense this one's going to be more playful. You shift in your seat again, and this time the stool groans loudly. A couple of heads turn. You offer a sheepish grin. No one really minds. They're already being pulled into the new current. The Hakawati's rhythm has changed. He's more animated now, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair like he's counting out drum beats. His eyebrows do half the talking. His voice rises and falls like a song you once knew but forgot you liked. The thief, as it turns out, doesn't steal for profit. No, he steals for rhythm, for the pure joy of throwing the local police schedule into chaos. Always Thursdays, never Fridays, and only items that are slightly irritating to lose: a mismatched sandal, a teapot lid, one curtain. You almost laugh out loud when the storyteller mimics the village constable's baffled frustration, raising his voice in a falsetto. What kind of monster steals a doorknob? The crowd roars. Even the waiter stops mid-pour, holding a kettle aloft like a frozen statue, then laughs with everyone else. And here's your historical anchor. In early 20th century Egypt, urban storytelling wasn't just confined to major tales or epics. Everyday humor, satire, and jokes about government officials were just as cherished, especially in cities like Cairo, where British colonial officers were a daily presence. Storytelling was a kind of soft rebellion, code switching with punchlines. In the tale, the thief eventually returns all the items he's stolen. Every last one polished and wrapped with a note, "I only wanted you to notice the missing things before they were truly gone." That lands differently. You hear a few murmurs. One woman near the front nods as if the line unlocked something private. And now, the Hakawati plays with pacing. He starts speaking faster, accelerating as the villagers try to uncover the thief's identity. There are false accusations. A camel is brought in for questioning, yes, seriously. A bearded shopkeeper claims his mustache has been stolen. The storyteller strokes his own beard dramatically, earning a fresh wave of laughter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Hakawatis in this era would travel with signature props, an umbrella. They never opened a tiny drum, they never hit, or even a caged bird they claimed was their editor. One even claimed his monkey helped him remember his place in a tale, though no one ever saw the monkey actually listen. As the story nears its climax, you realize the thief might not be a man at all. It might be a child, or a woman, or a ghost, or maybe the storyteller himself. That's the trick, isn't it? The story ends right before the truth does. And here's a quiet debate scholars still wrestle with. Was the ambiguity in these stories deliberate, crafted to reflect the uncertainty of colonial rule and political censorship, or was it just a creative flourish, a wink and nod to an audience that liked to fill in the blanks? There's still no scholarly consensus. You lean back now, the thief has vanished, the town is quieter, and the Thursday chaos is missed. Because what are we without our little disruptions, without the odd rhythms that remind us we're alive? Back in the cafe, someone starts tapping their glass with a spoon. A subtle rhythm, a heartbeat, not applause, more like punctuation. The Hakawati acknowledges it with the smallest of nods. Then he lifts one hand slowly and makes a circle in the air. The crowd understands. The thief will return someday, or maybe has already returned. Maybe they're sitting next to you. You look left, then right, just in case. Your tea's gone. You don't even remember finishing it. But your mind still swirls like it's steeping in something. Outside, the call to prayer begins. Not loud, distant, like a reminder from somewhere behind the buildings and beside the moon. Inside, no one rises just yet. They're waiting for the next story. So are you. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The cafe stills as he begins again, and this time the words fall heavy and smooth. There once was a man who never lied except when he sang. You blink. That's a new one. The storyteller folds his hands, index fingers pressed together like a steeple, and stares ahead, not at anyone in particular, just into the story's shape as it builds. The crowd leans in again, but now with different eyes. Not the giggling ones from the Thursday thief story. These eyes want something older, something trickier. He speaks slower now, not drowsy, methodical. You sense that this tale is made of layers, like onion skins or bureaucracy. Tonight's tale is a makama, a traditional Arabic literary form that dances between poetry and prose, satire and sincerity. They're often packed with con men, pious frauds, hypocritical scholars, and this one seems to be cut from that cloth. Here's your mainstream fact. Makamat storytelling was a major influence on Egyptian oral traditions in the early 20th century. These were not simple bedtime stories. They were linguistic gymnastics routines, showcasing clever turns of phrase, subtle social criticism, and dazzling wordplay. Think of them as the jazz solos of storytelling. In this story, the man who sings has a gift. His voice, ethereal, haunting, can silence birds. Women swoon, men pause mid-bargain to listen. He sings of truth, of justice, of loyalty, of purity. The twist, none of it is real. The man lives a life of deception. He swindles beggars, inflates prices, and once convinced an entire village that their well was cursed just to buy it cheap and resell it. But when he sings, people believe again, even those who know better. The storyteller pauses here, lets it soak. A waiter whispers to another behind you, just like politicians. You smirk into your empty glass. Now comes the meat of the tale. A sultan hears of this man and invites him to court. Offers him riches, a title, a wife, if he'll sing only for him. The man agrees. But at his first private performance, the Sultan weeps, not from beauty, but from shame. Your voice, the Sultan whispers, made me see myself too clearly. And here's your fringe fact. In some versions of these tales, the singer's voice is said to possess baraka, a kind of spiritual power or divine blessing. In others, he's clearly just a fraud with good lungs and better metaphors. Egyptian storytellers often blurred the line between sacred and scam for the sake of entertainment and a little philosophical whiplash. In this telling, the singer refuses to perform again. Not for the Sultan, not for anyone. He walks out of the palace and disappears into the desert. The crowd in the cafe is absolutely silent now. The only sound is a teaspoon clinking against a glass 3 tables away, once, twice, then nothing. The storyteller lets his hands rest in his lap. Then quietly, without drama, he says, "Some say he still sings, but only when no one is listening." You don't know what to do with that. Neither does anyone else, apparently. A few people look around like the ceiling might explain it. Someone mutters, not dismissive, just processing. And here comes your scholarly tension of the night. Historians still argue whether maqamat were meant as high art or low entertainment. Some believe they were a subtle tool of social subversion, mocking the elite and holding a mirror to society. Others claim they were elaborate linguistic play more admired for their style than their message. Either way, they were undeniably popular and deliberately slippery. The Hakawati now leans back in his chair, stretching slightly. You catch a flicker of a smile. He knows what he's done. He's given you a story that can't be finished. Back near the window, someone clears their throat as if to say, "Well, what now?" But no one speaks. Because when a tale ends like this, it leaves a little room inside you for something to grow, or fester, or echo. You glance over at the boy from earlier, still asleep, still dreaming. You wonder what his dreams sound like now. And then you hear it, the faintest hum. The storyteller, barely audible, is humming the melody from the tale. A tune with no lyrics, a lullaby for liars, a hymn for those who mean well but fall short. And for just a moment you think maybe you've heard it before. Maybe you've sung it. Maybe we all have. The heat has settled like a blanket now, thick and close, with the scent of ash and sugar baked into it. You shift on the stool again, not for comfort, but just to feel the air move against your back. The brazier in the corner lets off a puff of smoke, a hiss, like a breath being held too long. Someone at the back cracks sunflower seeds, their shells tapping the tin tabletop like raindrops. The Hakawati waits, not because he needs to, but because he can. That's the difference between a good storyteller and a great one. A good one knows what to say, a great one knows when not to say it. And then, the baker's daughter was born without a shadow. You frown, slightly intrigued. The man doesn't smile, he doesn't explain. He just lets the sentence sit there like something heavy and strange left at your doorstep. Everyone quiets again. Even the charcoal seems to stop snapping. He describes the girl, pale, almost translucent hair, the color of unripe wheat. She grows up in the back of her father's bakery where the walls sweat and the bread rises slow. But wherever she walks at noon, at dusk, under lamps or stars, there's nothing beneath her feet but light, not a trace of shade. Some say it's a blessing, others a curse, and because people in small streets never let the unknown be, they whisper. Here's your mainstream fact. In many parts of early 20th century Egypt, especially in poorer neighborhoods and provincial towns, folklore and superstition were often stronger than institutional religion. A person born with a strange mark or deformity could be seen as saint spirit or sorcerer, depending on who you asked or how your week had gone. The girl, we're told, grows used to the stairs. She never marries, not because no one asks, but because she's waiting for something or someone who understands her silence. And now the tale gets weirder. One day the girl begins to bake, not just bread, but shapes, tiny creatures, birds, even little dough men with smiles etched by fingernail. And when she places them in the oven, they come out whole, warm, and very, very alive. The cafe bursts into soft gasps and laughter. Someone murmurs, "Mashallah," One of the dough birds escapes into the rafters. Another tries to sell stale pretzels. A dough man proposes to a widow in the next alley. But as with all good things, the magic attracts attention. A jealous neighbor alerts the police, or maybe a British officer, or a jealous suitor. The Hakawati leaves that part blurry. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some old Egyptian tales include enchanted bread, not metaphorically but literally. One 19th century folk story from rural Garbia speaks of a baker who could raise the dead with flatbread provided he sang the right verse and the yeast was sorrow-fed, whatever that means. In this story, the girl is arrested. Her loaves are inspected, her ovens torn apart. But when the constable goes to read the charges, he looks up and she's gone. Not escaped, not run, gone like smoke through a sieve. And when they search the cell, they find only crumbs, and not a single shadow. The Hakawati's voice falls to a whisper. Some say she lives in the marketplace still baking little creatures when no one's watching. And if you ever find a pastry with eyes, be kind to it. The crowd doesn't laugh this time, not quite. They want to. But something in the tale settles strangely. It's not horror, it's something more familiar. The loneliness of being seen but not understood. You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. And here's tonight's scholarly shrug. Historians still argue whether these kinds of surreal magical stories were cultural holdovers from pre-Islamic mythology or improvisations by storytellers competing for attention in packed cafes. There's no clear line between what was ancient, borrowed, or entirely invented on the spot. That's part of the joy and the academic headache. The Hakawati rests his hands again. The story has ended. The silence stretches. You glance around. Several listeners shift uncomfortably like they've been handed a puzzle with one piece missing. The boy who'd been sleeping is awake now, rubbing his eyes with one hand, staring at the storyteller like he's just remembered who he is. Someone in the corner lights a cigarette. The ember glows red, then orange, then back to ash. You watch the smoke curl toward the ceiling and wonder just briefly what kind of bread your shadow would bake. The storyteller does not explain. He never does. The nights deepen now, not darker, just denser, like the air's grown tired and heavy from holding in too many secrets. You hear the scrape of a chair, the slow creak of someone shifting their weight, the long inhale of a hookah bubbling near the back. The coals crackle like they're clearing their throat. The Hakawati closes his eyes, and when he speaks, it's not with a story, not yet. It's with a sigh. Then the king lost his throne in a game of cards, but he kept the kettle. You blink, that's a start. The crowd chuckles, but softly. They know what kind of tale this is. This is one of those slow-burn fables, the ones that sound silly until the third act punches you in the ribs. The storyteller leans forward, elbows on knees again, and tells you about a king who was bored. Not corrupt, not cruel, just bored. The kind of bored that makes a man chase danger just to feel his own blood. So he disguises himself as a beggar and enters a cafe. Not unlike this one. He orders tea. He plays cards with farmers and tailors. He loses on purpose. Then he wins by accident. Eventually he bets the crown itself and loses for real. And here's your historical grounding. Gambling and card games were immensely popular in early 20th century Egyptian tea houses, especially during the British occupation. While technically frowned upon in formal religion, card games were part of the fabric of nightly life, played by tradesmen, students, and even soldiers. Many Hakawatis wove these familiar rhythms into tales to make them more grounded, more intimate. Back in the story, the king returns to his palace only to be turned away. He's forgotten the passwords. The guards don't recognize him, and he realizes maybe for the first time that no one really liked him. They liked the idea of him. But he still has the kettle. It's an old brass thing, dented and soot-stained, nothing royal about it except the way he pours. So he opens a small stall, starts serving tea. People stop by. They like the way he listens. He tells them stories, pretending they're things he overheard, pretending he wasn't there. Eventually, no one remembers he was ever king, not even him. And here's your fringe detail of the night. There's an urban legend that a former Ottoman prince once ran a sugarcane stand in Alexandria under an assumed name after his estate was seized during a political shuffle. No evidence exists, but ask around in the right cafes and people will swear their grandfather drank from his glass. In the story, the ex-king grows content, not happy exactly, but honest. One evening he sees a young man cheating at cards and doesn't say a word, just serves him tea, the same way someone once served him. And here comes tonight's scholarly tug-of-war. Historians still debate whether stories like this are rooted in genuine folk memory reflections of collapsed dynasties and humbled rulers, or were modern allegories dressed in old robes. Did they evolve to mirror the disillusionment many Egyptians felt toward monarchy and colonial puppetry in the 1920s, or were they just cozy fictions meant to level the playing field at least for a night? The Hakawati doesn't offer a theory. He just lets the ending hang. He boiled water every day, and the people said, "He makes good tea but great silence." Someone exhales near the window, a laugh maybe, or a sigh. The mood's unclear. The boy beside you is awake again, chewing on a crust of bread someone gave him. He doesn't look at the storyteller. He just stares into the middle distance like he's seeing something that hasn't happened yet. You shift slightly on your stool and feel your own reflection ripple inward. Not because you're a king, but maybe because you've made your share of bad bets. Who hasn't? Outside you hear the clip-clop of a mule cart. Somewhere a bell rings. Life goes on. But in here the kettle still simmers. The storyteller leans back, rubs his eyes. You notice for the first time that he's older than he sounds. Or maybe just weary. A waiter refills someone's glass with a thin stream of tea. No sugar this time, just quiet. And still the room doesn't shift. They're waiting, because the kettle's not empty yet. The pause before the next story isn't long. Just long enough for someone to cough, for the door to creak open and let in a puff of street dust, and for the boy beside you to finally blink. Then in the alley behind the palace there's a wall that listens. You didn't expect that. Neither did the rest of the cafe. A few heads tilt. One man mutters, "Not again," half smiling like this tale has teeth. The Hakawati doesn't flinch. He just continues, calm, deliberate. He says the wall is made of brick and lime like any other, old, cracked, but something about the way it was built, the angle of the stones, the silence of the workers, means it doesn't just echo. It remembers. People speak near it by accident, gossip, complaints, confessions, and over the years the wall starts whispering them back, quietly, never twice. Now and then someone walks by and hears a secret they never told, or hears their own voice say something they haven't said yet. The cafe crowd has gone still. A few listeners have folded their arms. This is a political story. They can feel it, even if it's dressed in dust and bricks. Here's your historical foundation. During British colonial rule in Egypt, particularly in the 1910s and 1920s, public cafes became not only places of storytelling, but also hotbeds of political commentary. Because direct speech could be dangerous, allegory thrived. Stories like this one of talking walls or wise fools were used to critique authority while slipping under the noses of watchful officials. In the tale, the wall's murmurs begin attracting attention. Someone claims it accused a pasha of stealing grain. Another says it recited a poem about a king who drowned in taxes. Soldiers are sent to investigate. And now it gets absurd. One soldier puts his ear to the wall and hears the sound of his own heart slowing down. Another hears his mother crying. The officer hears nothing but dreams that night of an uprising made entirely of birds. He doesn't return. Here's your quirky tidbit. It's been recorded that some Egyptian cafes during this period displayed veiled political cartoons disguised as decorative calligraphy. Lines from poetry would double as critiques of colonial figures or wealthy collaborators, readable only to those who knew the right references. A wall that talks, not so far-fetched. In the story, the authorities try to silence the wall. First, they build a new wall in front of it, doesn't help. Then they post a guard who disappears after 3 days. Finally, they cover it with British flags. That's when things get worse. The wall stops speaking, but now when people pass, they forget things. Their cousin's name, where they were headed, why they feel uneasy around red fabric. Eventually, the wall is abandoned, but the whispers don't stop. They just move to new corners, new alleys, new ears. And now comes tonight's scholarly debate. Some researchers believe the enduring presence of resistance themes in Egyptian oral tales of this period reflects a form of folk memory preserving the mood of national frustration long after the facts blur. Others argue that storytellers were simply intuitive entertainers responding to public tension like a singer adjusting key for the room. But that doesn't explain how certain themes lost power failing rulers, speaking shadows pop up across regions, and decades often uncannily synchronized with political unrest. The Hakawati lowers his voice. If you ever walk behind a palace wall and feel the hair rise on your neck, don't listen too hard. It's not always your name being spoken. A quiet hum runs through the cafe. No one speaks, but a man in the back glances at the stone wall behind the tea house, as if testing it, as if wondering. You stir your tea even though there's nothing left but dregs. The boy leans into your arm slightly. Not scared, just grounding himself. And you're wondering how many things you've said out loud today that you'd rather keep between your ears and your pillow. The Hakawati takes a slow breath. He lets the silence settle but not linger. He's ready for the next one. And the room, it's not just listening now, it's remembering. The Hakawati rubs his palms together slowly, as if warming them over the embers of his own words. The air in the cafe shifts again, not with movement, but with mood. This time he doesn't look at the crowd when he begins. He looks at the floor. She never crossed the threshold, but she always knew the endings. That line lands like a stone in a quiet room. Everyone in the cafe leans slightly instinctively, as though they all recognize who she is, or who she might be. He goes on. There's a house not far from here, he claims, where the shutters never open and the curtains never move. Behind those windows lives a woman, or a girl, or something between. No one remembers her coming. No one's ever seen her leave. But somehow she always knows what stories are being told in the cafe. Not just the endings. The twists, the deaths, the betrayals, the laughs that never landed. She finishes lines under her breath before the Hakawati does. You shift eyes drawn to the cafe's nearest window. There's nothing there, just a thin film of dust and the weak reflection of lantern light. And here's your historical anchor. In early 20th century Egypt, especially in more conservative households, it was not uncommon for women to remain secluded behind mashrabiyah, elaborate wooden screens that allowed them to see out without being seen. These women often became avid consumers of public life by proxy, gathering news, poetry, and gossip through filtered observation. Some became local legends, known for recalling entire stories or correcting details shouted from behind latticed balconies. Back in the story, the Hakawati explains how the woman behind the shutters has never been inside the cafe, and yet once she sent a note slipped under the door with no footsteps correcting a minor detail in a fisherman's tale. That night, the fisherman left the cafe without finishing his tea. He never came back. Another time she sent a riddle, 3 sentences, one of them untrue. It took the crowd 2 weeks to solve it. When they did, the cafe shook just slightly, like a breath being held too long. The Hakawati pauses and lifts a brow. What did the note say? Someone whispers. He shakes his head. You're not ready for that one. The cafe ripples with amusement and a bit of unease. The idea that someone somewhere is always listening, that doesn't sit as easily as it used to. And here's your quirky bit. There were real women known for this, not mythical ones, actual individuals. One woman in 1910's Alexandria was nicknamed Al-Mar'a al-Samita, the silent woman, and was believed to have memorized entire sections of 1001 Nights just from overhearing male storytellers from the upper floor of her family's home. Some say she interrupted a storyteller once by dropping a single lemon through a ceiling crack right at the moment he forgot a line. No one questioned her after that. The tale turns again. The woman in the window begins to hum. Only those who pass alone can hear it, and they each hear something different. One hears an old lullaby, another the scream of a donkey falling into a well. A British officer hears a verse from the Quran and resigns his post 2 days later, never explaining why. And now we're in the realm of speculation. Historians still argue whether these figures, these secluded women who somehow became public fixtures, were ever real, or if they were narrative projections of societal guilt, longing, or fear. Some say they represent the tension between visibility and power in a patriarchal culture. Others insist they were just great ghost stories with excellent acoustics. The Hakawati finishes the tale with one sentence. She never spoke aloud, but once the window breathed her name, and then he says nothing more. The cafe holds still. For a moment you imagine a breeze behind the curtain. You imagine a shadow that isn't yours. Then someone coughs, a spoon clinks against a cup. Life resumes, but not quite the same. You glance at the window again. Still nothing. Still nothing. The mood has turned strange now, not scary exactly, but tinged with that late-night electricity when the boundary between real and not real thins like old cloth. The Hakawati lifts his chin slowly, surveying the room. A few patrons shift in their seats, pretending they're not waiting, pretending they don't care what comes next. But then he says, when the moon is full and the lamps are low, the ghosts in the garden want stories too. Now that gets the room's attention. A few people smile, a few don't. One man near the corner makes a quick, casual sign against the evil eye, just in case. The storyteller leans in slightly. His voice gets softer, not louder, and you instinctively lean forward to catch it. He tells of a garden outside the city, overgrown, crumbling, abandoned for years. No one knows who it belonged to anymore. Some say it was a nobleman's, others claim it was cursed by a jealous rival. But everyone agrees on one thing: after dark, things move there. Not beasts, not bandits. Shapes, listening shapes. They don't speak, they don't chase. They simply gather when someone passes through, and they wait quietly, patiently for a story. If you tell them one, they let you go. If you don't, the storyteller lets that sentence trail off. The unspoken ending hangs in the room like a damp curtain. Here's your historical grounding. In early 20th century Egyptian society, particularly in rural areas, ghost stories were part of the fabric of nightly life. Spirits, arwah, jinn, and restless souls often appeared in local tales, not necessarily as evil but as reminders, warnings, witnesses. Many believed certain places, ruins, groves, wells, held listening spirits, and storytellers used these ideas to bind moral lessons with local superstition. Back in the tale, a boy dares to walk through the garden on a dare. He's cocky, laughing, carries a flute, but when he feels the air change, when he senses the silence thickening, he panics. He forgets all the stories he knows. He tries to sing, tries to hum. Nothing comes. Then from the darkness another voice begins to speak. A girl's voice, familiar. His sister's, his mother's. He can't tell. The shapes retreat. The boy collapses. When he wakes, he finds himself at the garden gate, alone with a jasmine flower in his pocket. Someone in the cafe exhales through their teeth. A quiet tisk of respect. Here's your fringe detail. Some Hakawatis carried small talismans or trinkets they claimed helped keep jinn from interrupting a performance. Whether out of showmanship or genuine superstition, no one knows. One particularly popular Cairo storyteller reportedly kept a pebble in his mouth during ghost stories to confuse wandering spirits. The Hakawati doesn't pause. He continues now, describing a man years later who walks into the same garden, but this time not on a dare. He's mourning. His wife has died, and he's lost the thread of his own voice. The neighbors hear him walking to the garden night after night, not speaking but listening. And one night, someone hears him telling a story again, soft, tender, like a prayer. From that point on, the garden begins to bloom again. No one sees the ghosts anymore, but when people pass by, they swear they smell her perfume. Here's tonight's scholarly shrug. Historians still argue whether ghost stories in early Egyptian oral tradition served as cautionary tales, cultural memory keepers, or simply popular entertainment. Some believe they emerged from real traumas, war, disease, grief wrapped in symbols. Others point to regional overlaps with Persian and Nubian folklore, suggesting a long tradition of borrowed bone rattlers. The truth? Probably all of it. The Hakawati takes a sip of water, now breaking the spell. You sit back, realizing you've been leaning too close to the table. Your back creaks in protest. The boy beside you is wide awake again, this time not with sleep in his eyes, but something else, something ancient. Around the cafe, no one talks for a moment. The stories have turned from entertaining to unsettlingly familiar, like they're less about faraway characters and more about you and what might be listening just outside the reach of the lamplight. You glance toward the door, still open a crack, the alley beyond it empty, or empty enough. The tension lingers like incense smoke, thin, fragrant, and a little suspicious. A few people in the cafe glance toward the corners where the shadows have settled too comfortably. Someone near the front shifts their chair just slightly farther from the door. But the Hakawati unfazed smiles, not a wide grin, just the kind of smirk you'd expect from someone who knows what story comes next. He places one hand on his knee and says, "A man once tried to sell a rug that told jokes, and it worked until it didn't." A ripple of laughter. A few relieved exhalations. The ghost garden may be behind you now, but you're not out of the strange woods just yet. This tale is different. Silly but sly. He's changed rhythm again, like switching keys on a dusty piano. The notes are brighter, but the melody still carries that little undercurrent of danger. The best ones always do. The man in question is a traveling merchant, not a successful one. His wares are forgettable, his pitch unconvincing. But one day, in a market near Luxor, he finds a rug rolled up in the back of a crumbling stall. The vendor shrugs. "It's stubborn," he says. He's not wrong. When the man takes it home and unrolls it, the rug sighs. Then it begins telling jokes. They're good jokes, great ones even. Political satire wrapped in proverbs. Jabs at officials, at police, at the British. Wordplay that would make a poet weep. And so the merchant becomes famous overnight. He doesn't even speak anymore, just rolls out the rug, stands back, and watches the laughter roll in. Here's your mainstream fact. In early 20th century Egypt, humor was a powerful, culturally embedded weapon. Popular comedy often took the form of riddles, double-meaning parables, and verbal slapstick. With British censorship tightening after the 1919 revolution, storytelling and casual performance became coded ways to say what couldn't be printed. In the story, the rug gains a following. Crowds gather. The jokes get sharper. One night it tells a joke so blistering about a colonial magistrate that the audience goes silent, then erupts into cheers. Someone swears they saw a pigeon fall off the roof laughing. But then the rug stops. Mid-joke, chokes almost. Its fringe curls slightly like it's annoyed. The next night it tells no jokes, only riddles. The riddles become sermons. The sermons become warnings, then nothing. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a real Egyptian folktale from the Nile Delta about a singing prayer mat that stopped working after someone with unclean feet stepped on it. While obviously fictional, it reflects a belief that humor and holiness aren't always separate and that misusing either might carry consequences. In the tale, the merchant panics. He begs the rug, he apologizes, he offers to clean it, feed it, sleep beside it. Nothing. Finally, the rug speaks once more. You laughed when you should have listened. I don't tell jokes, I tell mirrors. The next day, the merchant rolls it up and disappears. Some say he burned it. Others say he buried it beneath the largest stone in the market. A few believe he turned it into a coat and now wanders the country trying to tell the jokes himself badly. The Hakawati lets the cafe chew on that for a moment. And now your scholarly squabble historians still argue whether these types of magical object stories were metaphors for the responsibility of speech, especially among the rising nationalist class, or just absurd entertainment. Some scholars claim they were veiled critiques of public intellectuals who went silent under pressure. Others say sometimes a talking rug is just a talking rug. Back in the cafe, someone snorts. My uncle has a rug that only complains, he says. Laughter bubbles up again. The tension breaks. For now. You sip the last of your tea, bitter now from sitting too long. Fitting. The boy beside you whispers, what if the rug still tells jokes, but only in its sleep? You smile. You don't answer. You're not sure there is an answer. But you glance down anyway, just to check what you're sitting on. The laughter fades like steam off a brass kettle. You feel it thinning, cooling. People shift again, teacups scrape softly across tabletops, and someone mutters that their back's going numb. No one leaves, of course. Leaving now would feel like waking up halfway through a dream, or worse, a confession. The Hakawati leans back in his chair, his hands rest on his thighs. No drama this time, no clever smile, just a single breath. A donkey walked into a courtroom. The judge stood up. Scattered laughter again, but not too loud. The storyteller hasn't moved. His tone is still his face, unreadable. He begins. The donkey belonged to no one and everyone. It wandered through the streets of Cairo for years, not because it was lost, but because it had opinions. People swore it could read signs. Pause at the right ones. Ignore the rest. It once nodded at a police bulletin, once brayed in front of a wedding notice 10 seconds before the bride ran off. One day, during a trial about stolen bricks, the donkey walked into the courtroom. No one stopped it, and when it stood in front of the judge, it did not speak. It simply blinked, slowly, 3 times. And the judge said, I think we're the ones on trial. Now you've got people chuckling again. The room is relaxing into the rhythm. Everyone knows where this is going, or so they think. Here's your historical fact. Public criticism of colonial officials and local bureaucrats in early 20th century Egypt was often filtered through allegory. Animal stories were particularly popular. Monkeys for mayors, camels for cops, donkeys for, well, nearly everyone. Their stubbornness, wisdom, and lowly status made them the perfect vessels for truths no human dared to say aloud. In the tale, the judge calls for silence. The donkey doesn't move, doesn't even blink again, just stares. The spectators begin shifting, not because the donkey is doing anything, but because they start remembering things they didn't want to. Bribes, lies, that one thing they signed without reading. The donkey, it turns out, has nothing to say. But its presence says everything. A guard tries to escort it out. He breaks his ankle. A clerk faints. The judge sentences himself to 1 week of unpaid labor at a construction site. And the donkey. It walks out the way it came in, pausing only to drink from the fountain in the courtyard, a luxury it had apparently earned. Here's your fringe detail. There's a real documented Egyptian folktale about a donkey that was believed to carry the spirits of village ancestors and was therefore given legal immunity from being hit or worked during the full moon. It lived near Cana for years, and local children would feed it pomegranate peels as tribute. Back in the tale, no one sees the donkey again. But months later, whenever a court case drags too long or a judge seems particularly proud of himself, someone coughs in the gallery and mutters, better check the hallway for hooves. And the court goes quiet, just in case. Now for your scholarly debate, Historians still argue whether animal tales in Egyptian street storytelling were tools of subtle resistance or just clever distractions. Were they ways to preserve cultural memory under occupation, or just crowd pleasers for tired workers after sunset? The overlap between humor and heresy makes it hard to tell. That's part of their staying power. The storyteller lets this tale hang in the room for a moment, then adds, "If you ever see a donkey in a place, it shouldn't be, don't interrupt it, just listen." The room is smiling now, in that slow, contented way. You feel the mood turn warm again. You glance toward the boy beside you. He's drawn a donkey in the condensation on the glass tabletop. It has a hat. You don't ask why. Someone at the front orders another tea. The waiter sighs. His feet are probably screaming, but his eyes say he doesn't want to miss the next one either. And you're starting to believe that the smartest creature in Cairo might have had hooves all along. The next story doesn't begin with a word. It begins with a sound. A gentle exhale of steam from the back of the cafe. Someone pours hot water over mint leaves. A kettle whistles softly like a creature trying not to be noticed. The room hushes again almost automatically. And then the Hakawati begins. They say the hammam has 3 kinds of heat, fire, water, and secrets. That's all it takes. You're pulled in. This one doesn't take place in the cafe. It happens just down the street beneath an old stone arch where the city breathes differently, where the walls sweat and echo and sigh. He speaks of the hammam, the bathhouse, as a sacred kind of chaos. Men enter tired, hunched, grumbling. They come out lighter, not just cleaner, just less burdened. And in between, there are stories. Oh, so many stories. Here's your historical fact. The public bathhouse was a staple of Egyptian urban life well into the 20th century. Far beyond hygiene, it served as a communal space for socializing, political gossip, matchmaking, and more. And unlike cafes, it offered a kind of acoustic privacy, murmurs muffled by steam, voices softened by tile. In this tale, a boy apprenticed to the hammam's aging towel man learns to recognize men by the way they pour water, by the rhythm of their scrub, by how loudly they clear their throat before telling a lie. The boy doesn't speak much, but he listens. And when the water runs hot and the air gets heavy, that's when the real stories begin to drip out. A merchant confesses to hiding gold in his cousin's grave. A baker reveals he's been using salt from the soldier's storehouse. One man claims he saw a crocodile in a tiled basin once and hasn't bathed above his knees since. Here's your fringe detail. In some local Cairo traditions, bathhouse workers were considered part mystic, part therapist. A skilled Dalek masseur could read someone's tension and offer unsolicited advice mid-scrub, everything from marriage warnings to suggestions on debt management. Some were even feared for knowing too much after decades of overhearing everything in steam and echo. Back in the story, the boy begins to collect these stories. Not in writing, he can't read, but in memory, in gesture, in scent. He can recount your story from the way you place your sandals. Eventually, he begins telling them, quietly, only when alone. Until one day, a powerful man enters the hammam, someone who wears silk when no one's watching, someone who arrives with soldiers but bathes alone. The boy watches him carefully. The man says nothing. But that night, as the steam fades and the basins cool, the boy recites his story aloud only once, and the man still inside hears it. The next day, the hammam is closed, permanently, its walls whitewashed, its tiles broken, but the boy gone. Here's your academic tug-of-war. Historians still argue whether the hammam operated more as a masculine sanctuary or a surveillance machine. Some argue its enclosed, all-male environment fostered deep trust and cultural bonding. Others suggest it was a hidden engine of rumor, a place where reputations were cooked in the steam and sent back into the streets. The Hakawati lets this one fade slowly. His voice drops low like a whisper being passed under a towel. They say if you pour hot water at midnight in the right corner of the right hammam, the tiles remember your name. Someone in the cafe shivers, not dramatically, just a little shift of the shoulders. You're not even sure they noticed. The boy beside you isn't drawing anymore, he's listening with his whole face. And you suddenly remember the last time you stood alone with your thoughts and nothing else. No story, no music, no screen, just silence, heat, breath. And for a flicker of a second you wonder, what would your bathwater say if it could talk? A chair creaks softly. The hush of the crowd hasn't lifted, but it has changed. It's no longer the silence of listening. It's the silence of wondering what sort of world they've stepped into and whether there's a door back out. But the Hakawati isn't finished, not even close. He closes his eyes for a long breath, then says, "He came from the river and he brought stories that shimmered like heat on stone." The tone shifts again, not darker this time, but older, like dust on a drum or the hum of something ancient under your feet. He tells of a traveler, a man from Aswan with skin sun-darkened and sandals worn thin. He carries a satchel full of carved stones, bits of copper wire and a folded cloth soaked in river scent. He doesn't ask to tell a story, he's invited. Because word travels faster than donkeys. The cafes of Cairo have already heard of the Southern voice. A Hakawati from Nubia where the Nile flows like a god, and the stories don't bend, they sing. Here's your historical fact. Nubian storytellers brought distinct oral traditions into urban Egypt during the early 20th century, especially during labor migrations and cultural festivals. Their tales were often sung or chanted with rhythmic pacing, drawing from a different well of myth and metaphor than Cairo's urban styles. In the tale, the Nubian storyteller doesn't speak at first. He simply unfolds his cloth on the cafe floor. It's painted with symbols, fish stars, spirals, and he lays a smooth black stone in the center. Then he begins to hum. Low, steady, hypnotic, people quiet. Even the hookah pipes seem to draw breath more gently. When he speaks, his words fall like waves, soft, repeating. He tells of a crocodile who swallowed a flute and could only cry through melody, of a fisherman who traded his name for silence and became invisible, of a daughter born with river water in her veins who could only speak when it rained. It's not performance, it's invocation. Here's your fringe detail. Nubian storytelling was deeply tied to music and visual symbolism. Some tellers carried cloths marked with story sequences, a kind of portable mnemonic device. Others used song rhythms to preserve narrative structure over generations. Scholars now believe these rhythmic devices helped preserve oral accuracy better than memorized prose. Back in the story, the Southern voice finishes without applause. There is no laughter, no gasp, only a shared stillness and a few wet eyes. One man wipes his face and mutters, "I didn't know I needed to hear that." Someone else adds, "I didn't even know what that was." But they stay seated, they stay quiet. And now comes your scholarly debate. Some historians argue that Nubian oral traditions were minimized or erased during Egypt's nationalist movements in the early 20th century, seen as regional or folk rather than national. Others now believe these voices were essential undercurrents blending into Cairo's cafe culture and subtly reshaping its rhythm. The truth, as always, is tangled. In the story, the Southern voice packs up his cloth, his stone, and his silence. But before he leaves, he offers the Hakawati of Cairo a gift, a song with no words, a story that only lives when it's hummed. The Hakawati leans forward now just slightly and hums it, right there in the cafe. 3 notes. No one recognizes them, and yet every listener feels something pull deep in their chest, like an old key turning in a door they forgot was locked. The boy beside you closes his eyes, not asleep, just traveling somewhere else. You hear a sniffle, a cough, the scrape of a chair as someone shifts, not wanting to cry over a story they didn't even understand. And still no one leaves. Not yet. because this night isn't over. And the river, it's still flowing right through the cafe floor, right through your ribs, right through the stories waiting for their turn. The room feels different now, not heavier, not lighter, just wider, like the walls have stepped back a little to make room for something larger than language. The Hakawati doesn't speak right away. He looks at the crowd not through them, but into them, like he's checking who's still awake in their minds, not just in their seats. Then he smiles faintly and says, "A man once sold cursed sandals. They fit everyone, but no one walked the same way twice." There's a beat of silence, then soft laughter, curious, willing. You shift again and your foot bumps the boy's. He doesn't notice. He's watching the storyteller with open awe hands still pressed on the table like he's afraid the story might drift away if he doesn't hold on. This tale is closer to home. The storyteller begins describing the sandal merchant, a thin man with enormous eyebrows and no known address. He appeared suddenly in Cairo's Khan el-Khalili market one summer carrying nothing but a threadbare cloth and 4 pairs of sandals, each hanging from pegs on a bamboo frame. The sign read, "Guaranteed regret or full refund." Naturally, they sold out in an hour. Here's your historical fact. Khan el-Khalili has been Cairo's central marketplace for centuries, but during the early 1900s, it became more than a souk. It became a stage. Street vendors, snake charmers, traveling mystics, and impromptu storytellers all worked the crowd. Merchants with odd claims often became part of oral folklore themselves, especially those who seemed just strange enough to be remembered. In the story, each sandal buyer finds that the shoes fit perfectly no matter their size, shape, or age. But the moment they wear them, their lives go crooked. One man walks out of the market and into a stranger's wedding, convinced it's his. He gives a toast no one understands and leaves before the dessert. A woman walks into the Nile and doesn't drown, she floats reading a book. A soldier walks backward into a doorway and wakes up 3 days earlier. The cafe crowd is grinning now, you can feel it. This is one of those stories. Mischief wrapped in metaphor, a dream that tiptoes close to nightmare but never steps on your toes. And here's your quirky tidbit. There was a real superstition in some Cairo districts that second-hand shoes could carry the memories or curses of their previous owners. Some stalls refused to sell used footwear entirely, claiming it confused the path of God's will. In the story, things escalate. The mayor of a small district tries the sandals, immediately loses all sense of direction. He's found 2 days later asleep on the roof of a school, convinced he's the headmaster. His wife has to bribe the teacher not to report him. The merchant never returns. No one remembers what he looked like, only the sandals and the regrets. But here's where the Hakawati lowers his voice just a notch. Some say the sandals still move on their own, that they travel at night finding new feet. And that regret isn't a punishment, it's a map. You feel the weight of that, not in a dramatic way, just enough to make you glance at your own shoes. And here comes tonight's scholarly wrinkle. Historians still debate whether tales of enchanted or cursed objects in Egyptian street storytelling were influenced more by older Islamic traditions, by ancient pharaonic myth, or by imported colonial anxieties. Some believe they served as symbolic critiques of modernization, where ordinary things like shoes, clocks, even tea kettles suddenly gained unsettling power. The storyteller pauses, tilts his head like he's hearing the end of the story, just a moment before you do. Then, if your shoes ever carry you somewhere strange, ask yourself who's walking whom. Someone lets out a soft "Ya Latif" under their breath, a gentle invocation of divine protection. Another person nudges their sandals off and folds their feet beneath them, just in case. You check your own laces, still there, still ordinary. But your mind, that's wandering a little. Back to all the choices that felt perfect in the moment. Back to the paths that somehow curled away from where you meant to go. And forward, always forward to the next story waiting just around the corner of memory. The wind outside stirs just briefly, a soft rustle through the door curtain like someone passing without entering. You hear the gentle rattle of the tin lanterns above one of them swinging slightly, as if remembering an old rhythm. The Hakawati's voice returns before the room settles, calm, crisp. Some stories are accidents, some are warnings, and some are spilled sugar you can never sweep back into the bowl. The laughter dies quietly. You can feel the shift. This one's going to sting a little. He tells of a cafe very much like this one. Maybe this one, a regular crowd, regular drinks, regular gossip. Until one night a storyteller arrives from out of town. No name, no invitation, just a voice with gravel in it and eyes that know too much. He sits, takes tea, and begins a tale about a man with two wives. One he loved, one he didn't. Neither of them knew which was which. The story is funny at first, then sharper, then suspiciously specific. And then someone at the far table stops laughing. Here's your historical fact. In early 20th century Egypt, storytelling was often used not just for entertainment, but as a form of social commentary and occasionally exposure. Storytellers were known to deliver thinly veiled criticisms, or even rumors through narrative. A clever Hakawati could shame a corrupt official, reveal an affair, or question loyalty, all without naming names. But everyone knew who was meant. Back in the tale, the story continues. The storyteller describes the man's habits in detail, the way he ties his sash, the way he smells faintly of sesame oil and always clears his throat twice before speaking. People glance around, because someone in the cafe does that, and he's sitting right there. A woman at a nearby table goes still. Her tea glass trembles just slightly in her hand. The Hakawati pauses here in real life, mimicking the suspense. The room in your story and the room around you now feel like mirrors. Then he continues. The man in the tale tries to leave, but wherever he goes, people finish the story before he speaks. They whisper the punchline in markets, mutter the betrayal behind mosque walls, chant his shame in the hammam steam. And eventually he stops speaking altogether, becomes mute, not from illness, from being heard too clearly. Here's your fringe detail. In some Egyptian cafe traditions, it was believed that speaking ill of someone too cleverly, turning their sin into a story, could curse your own tongue. Certain storytellers were rumored to have taken vows of silence for years after a particularly cruel tale hit too close to the bone. In the story, the stranger finishes his tea and leaves. He never returns. But after that night, everything changes. Conversations become careful. Jokes stop halfway. The tea isn't sweeter, it's just watched more closely. And the man at the far table? He doesn't show up the next evening, or ever again. No one speaks of him, and yet his chair is never filled. Here's your scholarly shrug. Historians still argue whether these targeted tales were acts of civic justice, performative gossip, or passive-aggressive warfare. Some claim they empowered the powerless, giving voice to public frustration. Others argue they were thin excuses for humiliation or social policing. Either way, their power was real and deeply respected. The Hakawati takes a sip now, carefully, slowly, as if to say, "This one you sip, not gulp." He lets the weight of the story rest. The cafe is quieter than it's been all night. Someone clears their throat just once. You glance sideways. The boy beside you is holding his breath. And you're thinking about the things you've said when you thought no one was listening, about the people who might have heard, about the stories that started in whispers and somehow found their way into strangers' mouths. The storyteller closes with one final line. If a story ever feels like it knows you, it probably does. No laughter now, just silence. Not awkward, just careful, as if even the furniture knows what not to say. The silence in the cafe doesn't feel empty, it feels full, as if every unspoken word from the last tale is still floating above the tables, hanging like low smoke. The Hakawati exhales through his nose, rubs one palm against the other, and without looking up, begins again. Sometimes when the air turns warm too quickly, the jinn come looking for old promises. A few people make the sign again, fingers brushing against the collarbone, half habit, half hope. You can almost hear the collective bracing. Everyone knows this kind of story, or thinks they do. This one starts in a village. Doesn't matter which one. Could be anywhere, with cracked walls, a rusted well, and the weight of too many secrets. In the story, a girl is born with a streak of silver in her hair and eyes that shimmer oddly when the lantern light flickers. Her grandmother says that child has something watching over her. Her father replies, no, something watching through her. They both end up being right. Here's your historical fact. Belief in jinn, spiritual beings mentioned in the Quran and woven deeply into Islamic folklore, was widespread in 20th century Egypt, especially in rural areas. They weren't necessarily evil, but they weren't safe. People left offerings at crossroads, avoided certain ruins, and whispered apologies into wells just in case. Back in the story, the girl grows up quiet but observant. She never stumbles, never cries. She says strange things at breakfast like, "You'll break your ankle today," or "the red goat is lying." By lunchtime, both things are true. Eventually, her village decides she is either blessed, cursed, or both. And then one summer night, when the wind is hot and the dogs won't bark, something walks into the village. Not a man, not quite a shadow. A figure wrapped in smoke and silence, carrying a sack made of ash and string. It says it's come for the girl. The villagers, brave in groups and terrified alone, gather outside her door. But when they open it, she's gone. Only the smell of burnt jasmine remains. The Hakawati pauses. A kettle clicks in the corner. The sound feels louder than it should. You glance around. No one's moved. One old man near the window clutches his rosary beads a little tighter. Here's your fringe detail. Some rural Egyptian communities used to perform jinn cleansing rituals, using smoke from burning myrrh and Quranic recitations. But others believed the only real protection was silence. Don't speak of them. Don't name them, and above all, don't ask for stories about them, because that was seen as an invitation. In the tale, the villagers begin to forget her, not just her face, her name, her voice, her room. It's like she never existed, until one evening years later, the wind shifts again. A small boy walks into the village and says, "My mother says hello. She's still watching through the silver," and then he vanishes. Here's your scholarly back-and-forth. Historians still argue whether stories of jinn interactions were literal beliefs, metaphorical frameworks for mental illness and trauma, or simply cautionary tales meant to encourage humility and obedience. The line between fear, faith, and folklore is almost impossible to draw cleanly. The Hakawati ends the story with a whisper, "When the wind gets too warm too fast, close your windows. Not to keep them out, but to keep you in." A few people shift in their seats. One person takes a sip of water like it might wash away the goosebumps. The boy beside you clutches the edge of the table, not scared, just holding still, like someone being watched by something they can't see. And you suddenly feel very aware of the open door behind you and the fact that the breeze just died. Someone gets up to close it, slowly, quietly, and the Hakawati, he doesn't look up. But you get the feeling he knows what just passed by. A fly buzzes briefly through the cafe, tracing a lazy loop around the lantern before vanishing into the shadows near the ceiling. No one swats at it. It's not brave enough to interrupt tonight. The Hakawati leans back, stretches one leg slightly, and almost conversationally says, "Sometimes if you listen closely, truth doesn't shout. It folds itself into riddles, into rhymes, into stories no one claims to have told." This one starts small. A boy and his uncle walking home from the market. The uncle's muttering about taxes. The boy's trying to remember a joke he heard. It's early evening, nothing strange, until they hear it. A voice floating from a side alley, clear, calm, familiar. It's telling a story. But not just any story. one about the mayor stealing grain and blaming a dead servant, a story about the merchant who switched identities to dodge debts, about the teacher who takes bribes to pass failing sons of officers, all told without names, but with just enough detail that anyone who listens knows exactly who's who. Here's your historical fact. British authorities in colonial Egypt tightly censored newspapers and public political speech, especially after the 1919 revolution. In response, ordinary Egyptians developed layered codes of resistance using folk songs, jokes, and storytelling as safe spaces for public truth-telling. What couldn't be written could still be heard. In the tale, the boy and his uncle follow the voice, but when they turn the corner, the alley is empty. No speaker, no lantern, just dust. They return the next evening. The voice is there again. A new story, this time about the officer whose dog runs secret messages about a priest who trades absolution for lemons. Each night someone new listens, and each night someone recognized in the tale leaves the city the next day. Soon, the alley becomes crowded. People stop bringing tea and start bringing paper, writing down the words, trying to decode the voice. That's when it stops. Here's your fringe tidbit. In the 1920s, during heightened crackdowns, Egyptian cafes in Cairo and Alexandria reportedly used coded chalk markings on doors or bricks to signal whether sensitive stories would be told that night. These chalk marks vanished by morning. So did the people who asked too many questions. Back in the story, silence fills the alley for 7 nights. Then one morning, every single cafe in the quarter finds the same note slipped under its door. You listened when you needed to. Don't ruin it by asking who I was. And now the Hakawati lets the weight settle, but not for long. Because this story doesn't end there. He says that some believe the alley itself remembers the voice. That on certain nights, if you walk past just after dusk and say the right proverb, the stones will echo back a line from the tale. And if it does, you're now part of the story too. Here's tonight's scholarly tug-of-war. Historians still argue whether these anonymous truth-telling tales were real oral phenomena or narrative mythologizing. Some say there were actual storytellers who risked their lives to speak against power. Others claim these tales emerged later, reshaped by memory and longing into convenient parables of resistance. Either way, they endure, perhaps because their uncertainty makes them safer to believe. The storyteller finishes with a simple question spoken into the hush like a pebble dropped into a pond. If truth dressed up as fiction walked past you in the street, would you recognize its shoes? Someone lets out a breath. Another stirs their tea without sipping it. You glance around. The people in the cafe look the same, but somehow more alert. The boy beside you is biting his lip. And you start to wonder how many of your memories came from stories someone else told, and how many of your truths are just fictions you've never dared to question. The voice fades again, and this time it leaves a quiet you didn't know you needed. By now, the cafe is no longer just a room. It's a container, holding stories, yes, but also breath, heartbeat, memory. You're not sitting on a wooden stool anymore. You're perched on the edge of someone else's dream, one you've been inside for hours, maybe longer. The Hakawati stretches his fingers one by one, cracks his knuckles without apology, and with no introduction he begins. The cat, with no shadow, didn't need to speak. She just showed up where the lies were thickest. Someone near the back quietly says, "Ah, that's all." Just that one gentle sound of recognition. This one's a favorite, or maybe a warning. The line between those two is thin tonight. He describes the cat as black, not midnight black, not glossy, just unlit, like someone forgot to paint her all the way. She appears in villages, bazaars, palaces, always the same way, alone, silent and utterly unimpressed. No collar, no name, no shadow. And wherever she walks, things change. Not drastically, just enough to ruin certain evenings. Here's your historical fact. Cats have always had a special place in Egyptian culture, both ancient and modern. In early 20th century Cairo, they were common in cafes, markets, and even courtyards of mosques. Some believed they carried spirits or chased them. Others saw them as harmless freeloaders with impeccable taste in food and drama. Back in the story, the cat shows up in a scribe's office, stares at the inkpot. The scribe, a chronic liar for hire, suddenly finds his pen won't move. The ink congeals. When he tries to speak, his words come out backward for 3 days. Then she appears in a grocer's stall. The man has been watering down milk. She curls up on the counter. Within the hour, every bottle spoils. His teeth ache for a week. The pattern is clear. She visits dishonesty. Not the kind whispered between lovers. Not the soft lies that hold families together. No, she comes for the ones that corrode, the lies that become policies, the ones that stain the ledger, not the pillow. Here's your fringe detail. There was a folk tale circulating through parts of rural Egypt about a cat of the crescent moon who served as a divine inspector of justice. If you mistreated an orphan, sold spoiled dates, or underweighed your lentils, she'd appear, not to punish, but to watch. And somehow that was worse. In the story, a judge sees her in the rafters during a trial. He glances up once, just once, and then acquits a man who's been falsely accused. Afterward, he walks out into the street and retires on the spot. No explanation, just a nod. Some believe she's a djinn, others an old god's last errand. Some say she's what's left when truth gets tired of asking politely. But here's the twist. She's not invisible. Anyone can see her. You just have to be willing to look. And when you do, you might not like where she's sitting. The Hakawati pauses, then adds quietly, they say she visited a cafe once, just sat under a certain man's chair. The man stood up and never told another story again. There's a soft rustle now, eyes dart, jokes die on lips. And now your scholarly scuffle of the evening historians still argue whether figures like the shadowless cat are remnants of ancient Egyptian symbolism where animals carried divine traits, or simply adaptive folklore shaped by Islamic allegory. Some think she's a moral compass in feline form. Others argue she's narrative evolution, an icon created by storytellers to scare liars straight. The storyteller doesn't offer an opinion. He only adds, if you ever see a cat where no shadow falls, don't run. Just tell the truth, out loud, to yourself, even if it hurts. Then silence. One person shifts their feet under the table. You can feel the whole room suddenly remembering all the little dishonesties they've told today. The small ones, the necessary ones, the ones that made everything easier for now. The boy beside you whispers, do you think she's real? You don't answer, not because you don't know, but because for just a second you're afraid that answering might make her appear. The air in the cafe has turned heavy again, not from heat, not from smoke, from attention, from the weight of people leaning inward, not physically but emotionally. Minds open, walls lowered, everyone waiting for whatever comes next, even if they don't want it. The Hakawati doesn't speak at first. He closes his eyes, breathes in, breathes out. Then, the dervish didn't tell stories. He became them. That earns a few lifted brows. Someone mutters something about Sufis and spins. The boy beside you sits up straighter. He knows this one will dance. The tale begins in a narrow alley, one filled with lamp smoke, stray cats, and a single drumbeat echoing off the stone. That's where the dervish appears. Whirling slowly in place, robes fluttering like old sails, eyes closed. He doesn't speak, doesn't stop, but each spin changes something. A shadow vanishes. A stain on the wall reappears. A man sitting nearby suddenly remembers his mother's face. And then, without warning, the dervish opens his mouth and speaks someone else's memory. In full, verbatim, word for word. The man gasps. It was a story he'd told no one, not even himself, not in years. Here's your historical fact. Sufi mystics, particularly the Mevlevi order known for their whirling practices, were active in Egypt during the early 20th century. While not traditional storytellers, their poetry, chants, and public rituals often inspired tales and urban legends. Many Egyptians believe Sufis walked the line between seen and unseen, between metaphor and miracle. Back in the tale, the dervish continues to appear, not nightly, just when he's needed. He doesn't walk, he arrives. Outside a courthouse on the day of a crooked verdict. In a hospital garden where a woman has stopped hoping. Near a boy who can't sleep because his brother never came home. He doesn't speak for long, just one story each time, always someone else's, always one that needs to be heard aloud, even if no one wants it to be. Here's your fringe tidbit. In some Cairo neighborhoods there were rumors of wandering saints who could appear in times of emotional unrest, speak a single line of truth, and vanish. Some believed they were real. Others thought they were invented by cafe-goers who needed a divine audience for their grievances. The storyteller says the dervish eventually visits the cafe. Not this one, but one like it. He spins at the door once, twice, then stops. He looks around and says a single sentence, "The story you're all afraid of telling, it's already been told, just not by you." Then he leaves. And the patrons are never the same. One begins writing letters again. Another returns home after 10 years. The owner pulls out a dusty oud and sings a song he said he forgot decades ago. The dervish, he's last seen walking straight into the Nile, not sinking, not floating, just becoming smaller and smaller until the river finishes the sentence. Here's your scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these figures, mystical interlopers who seem to channel other people's truths, were inspired by real Sufi encounters or were narrative devices meant to externalize inner reckonings. Either way, their stories persist across Egypt, Turkey, Sudan, and even parts of southern Europe. The Hakawati finishes quietly. If a stranger ever tells your story better than you can, maybe it's time to stop spinning in silence. There's no laughter, no gasp, just breath. The soft kind people take when they've remembered something they thought was forgotten on purpose. The boy beside you isn't doodling anymore. He's holding his thumb and index finger together, mimicking the shape of a small circle like he's turning something invisible. Slowly, thoughtfully, you look down. Your hands are doing the same. And in the flickering lamp glow, you wonder how long they've been moving like that. The room hasn't settled since the dervish left it. Not the room in the story, and not this one either. You can feel it in the way no one clears their throat, in how no chairs scrape the floor. It's a silence that's not afraid. It's listening, still spinning just a little. But the Hakawati leans forward again now, and the crowd instinctively folds toward him, like reeds to a breeze. He begins softly. They strung up a white sheet between two walls, and suddenly truth had shadows. A low chuckle rolls through the front rows. The older listeners nod. Everyone knows what this is. This is the shadow show. A simple courtyard tucked behind two shops. Narrow, uneven, open to the stars. Someone hammers in two nails. A boy holds up a lantern. Another boy holds up his hands. The shapes begin to move. But they're not just shapes. They're people. Politicians, landlords, English officers with enormous noses and wobbly legs, peasants with heroic chests and dreams as big as their donkeys. And none of it is written down. Not a word. Here's your historical fact. Arago's the Egyptian shadow puppet tradition has roots going back centuries. By the early 20th century, it was thriving in Cairo's alleys and public squares, blending slapstick comedy, biting satire, and surprisingly nuanced commentary. It was one of the few performances that could criticize the powerful, especially when no official name was spoken. In this tale, a shadow show becomes famous, not because of its artistry, but because it knows too much. Every Tuesday, a new story. Always with different puppets, but the same unmistakable personalities. A pasha who raises taxes and accidentally marries his horse. A general who can't read a map and ends up in Sudan while aiming for Alexandria. A banker who lends only to his own reflection. No one names names, but everyone knows that's the game. Here's your quirky detail. Some puppeteers hidden behind the screen were blindfolded to protect them from being identified later. Others performed using fake accents, disguising even their whispers. And yet they kept performing week after week, often sponsored quietly by merchants or cafe owners with a bone to pick. Back in the story, one evening the show starts late. People murmur, waiting. A boy with the lantern paces. The sheet rustles. Then a puppet appears, not comedic, just a silhouette of a man standing still. The puppeteer says nothing, but the man's shadow bows and then vanishes. No punchline, no music, just gone. The crowd doesn't know what it means. But the next morning, the district's police chief resigns. Coincidence, maybe. But the show doesn't return the next week, or the one after. And then one night, someone tries to perform a different show. Different puppets, different jokes. The sheet catches fire. No one is hurt, but no one performs there again. And here comes your scholarly wrinkle. Historians still argue whether political satire via shadow puppetry directly influenced public sentiment during British occupation or merely reflected it. Some claim it radicalized the illiterate poor. Others insist it simply kept people sane. Either way, colonial authorities tried repeatedly to censor or regulate these shows, usually with mixed success. The storyteller doesn't push the ending. He lets it settle like ash, then says some truths are easier to watch than to say, especially in silhouette. Someone in the cafe claps once, then stops, unsure if it's allowed. A few others smile. The laughter this time is quiet and communal, like a shared blanket. You feel it too, that strange comfort of something being said without being said. The boy beside you whispers, "Can we make shadows at home?" You nod. But inside you wonder what would happen if one of those shapes on your wall started moving on its own, or bowing, or telling your story back to you in silence. There's a subtle shift in the room now, like gravity remembering its job. People are still, but they're no longer waiting. They're following, drawn forward, carried along. No one checks the time, no one yawns. Every face wears the same expression, quiet, curious surrender. The Hakawati brushes imaginary dust from his lap, a showman's habit, or maybe just reflex. Then he begins casually. There was once a tale that didn't want to be told. You feel something lift in the air. Interest maybe, or a thread of unease. He tells of a village where stories had personalities. Some were eager. They ran to the lips, demanded to be told, tumbled out even when no one asked. Others were shy. They waited patiently, speaking only when spoken to. But this one ran away. No one could remember it fully. People would try over tea, over tobacco, on wedding nights or funerals, and always the words slipped from their mouths like soap in the bath. Here's your historical fact. In many Egyptian oral traditions, stories were considered to have life, a kind of spirit that chose its moment and its teller. Forgetting a tale midway wasn't just embarrassing, it was interpreted by some as a sign the story wasn't ready yet. Some storytellers refused to continue if interrupted, believing they'd offended the tale itself. Back in the story, an old woman says the tale once belonged to a shepherd who died mid-sentence. Another insists it came from a cracked tomb carved into the stone but worn smooth by wind. A child claims he heard it in a dream, but when asked to repeat it, he chokes on a cherry pit. No one can find the tale, until one day a neighbor dreams of a voice that says, "I'm not lost, I'm hiding from you." Here's your quirky tidbit. There was a Cairo storyteller in the 1910s known as Hakawati al-Sakit, the silent storyteller who would spend entire evenings simply sitting, occasionally humming, letting others tell tales instead. People came from across the city just to be near him. Many believed he carried an untold story so powerful it could only be shared by not speaking it. Back in the tale, one man becomes obsessed. He starts collecting fragments, words, gestures, themes. Every half-remembered parable, every forgotten metaphor, he strings them together like beads. And one night, he thinks he's got it. He climbs onto a table in the village cafe and begins Once there was a tale that, and the lights go out. Every candle, every lantern, the hearth, the moon, even the stars. Dark, total, silent. And when the light returns just seconds later, the man is gone. So is the table. So is the story. And now the villagers stop trying to tell it. Not from fear, from respect. They say that some stories are listeners, that they walk among us not to be known but to know, and if you try to speak them, they leave. And here's your scholarly debate. Some academics believe these resistant stories, narratives, that slip through memory or elude repetition represent cultural trauma. Events or emotions too large, too painful, too sacred to condense into neat arcs. Others argue they're simply performance embellishments, a clever trick to make the audience lean in to chase a ghost they'll never catch. The Hakawati ends quietly without a smile. If you ever meet a story that won't be told, don't chase it. Just sit beside it. Let it rest. The room is hushed again. The boy beside you has goosebumps on his arms. And you find yourself trying to remember the ending to a story you're not sure you ever heard. A name on the tip of your tongue. A tale walking just ahead of you, out of reach, around a corner you can't quite turn. It's late now. You can feel it, not in the hour but in the hush. The stillness has changed shape. It's not the alert quiet of listening. It's the softer, heavier calm that drapes itself over people who've been somewhere together. The kind of silence that says, we're not strangers anymore. The Hakawati leans back slowly, like a bridge drawing itself in. His voice is almost conversational, but the words land with gravity. When the tea runs dry, only the truest stories remain. He lets that hang. No rush. This is the slow part, the circling, the descent. He begins to speak of endings, not deaths, not closures. Just that last hour in a cafe when chairs scrape a little louder, when people look at their shoes more than each other. He tells of a tea house just like this one, same creaky stools, same glassy-eyed teapots, same faces night after night. And he tells of the last regular, an old man who never told a story himself but who never missed one. Always in the same seat, always two sugars never stirred. He'd listen, nod, laugh, only when no one else did. And when a story ended, he'd always say the same thing, that one was true, but not in the way you think. Here's your historical fact. Many cafes in early 20th century Egypt had their own anchor figures, usually elderly men who spent more hours inside than the owners themselves. They were respected as living archives, rememberers of old wars, older scandals, and tales long gone from public memory. A Hakawati story gained weight if one of these listeners approved. In the tale, one night, the old man doesn't come. At first, no one notices, but when the teapot is poured and the stool stays empty, people begin to whisper. By the third night, someone tries to sit in his spot. The stool breaks. Here's your fringe detail. Some storytellers believe certain seats in a cafe held memory residue even. One Alexandria performer swore his best stories came only when he sat on a particular cushion that remembered rhythm. When it was stolen, he claimed his voice lost its echo. Back in the story, the old man is never seen again. But that night, after the last story ends, the cafe's teapot pours one more cup on its own. No one drinks it. But the scent hangs in the air, cinnamon lemon, something unfamiliar but comforting. And the next story the Hakawati tells just 3 nights later is one no one's ever heard before, not even him. He doesn't remember saying it, but everyone agrees it was the best one. And now comes your scholarly scuffle. Some researchers argue that this idea of stories arriving from elsewhere is just mythology. Storytellers, they say, are professionals, performers who plan and adapt. But others insist there's something more mysterious at work. Call it ancestral memory, spiritual transmission, or just the magic of repetition, but somehow the story knows when to come, and who's ready to hear it. The Hakawati looks around now slowly, eyes half-lidded. His voice dips softer still. Tonight, when you leave, there may be one more story waiting for you. Not here, not from me, but outside in the quiet part of your walk home. Someone shifts. A woman smiles into her scarf. No one moves to leave. And the tea, it really is gone. You glance at your cup, nothing but a circle of light at the bottom, not even dregs left, just warmth. And the boy beside you, he's staring into his glass like he expects to see words forming there. Maybe you are too. The night is thinning now, but it refuses to end. You feel it in your limbs, not fatigue exactly, but that quiet ache of having held still for too long in a single spellbound place. Outside, the wind brushes the shutters. A dog yawns somewhere down the alley. Inside, the lamps flicker but do not die. The Hakawati speaks again gently, almost to himself. There was once a tale that ended without applause, just breath. And this is that tale. He tells of a storyteller, not a famous one, not feared, not praised, just present, reliable, someone whose stories arrived like bread, daily, familiar, warm. No one remembered his name. They called him the voice or the one with the sandals or uncle. He never corrected them. He told stories for years, in cafes, at weddings, under trees, beside graves. Always the same, a small audience, a smaller cup of tea, a story that slipped in sideways and left you lighter than before. But one evening he stands up in a cafe like this one. He places his hands behind his back, and he says, "I don't think I have any left." A hush. Someone chuckles, thinking it's a setup. It isn't. The man sits down, crosses his arms, waits, but nothing comes. No words, no spark, just silence. Here's your historical fact. Some traditional Hakawatis believed in the concept of story death, a moment in a storyteller's life when the stories no longer came. Not because of memory loss or illness, but because the tales themselves had chosen to move on. The storyteller was simply the vessel, and vessels eventually run dry. In the tale, the cafe crowd waits for him to recover. They wait all night. He does not speak. He smiles. But it's the smile of someone who's made peace with departure. After he leaves, people begin telling his stories, at first just as tribute. But over time, they change, adapt. They grow funnier, sharper, softer, and somehow always end just before the last detail, as if the storyteller left a thread hanging for someone else to finish. Here's your fringe detail. There are accounts, half myth, half memory, of certain cafes where storytellers' names were never spoken aloud after they passed. Instead, their empty chairs were treated like family heirlooms. You could sit in them, but never lean back. Back in the story years later, someone tries to tell the very last tale he told, the one he didn't tell. They get all the way to the final line, and then forget it. Every time. No matter how many times they try. Even today. Even now. And here comes the academic murmur. Scholars still argue whether stories like these reflect real cultural phenomena or narrative ritual. Were these forgotten endings a way of creating community ownership over memory? Or were they a poetic flourish, storytellers creating space for silence in a noisy world? The Hakawati doesn't answer. He just lets the silence settle into the corners like dust. Then he says, "Some stories don't end. They simply rest. In people, in chairs, in teacups." He closes his eyes for a breath, then opens them, looks around the cafe at each listener, not with showmanship, but with something gentler, something real. You feel it, that shared knowing, that unspoken truth. The best stories aren't the ones that finish. They're the ones you carry home in your chest, still whispering. The boy beside you exhales, almost disappointed, but not quite. He knows it's not over. Not really. The Hakawati doesn't speak right away. He lets the stillness stretch, not to be dramatic, but to be gentle, to prepare the room for something softer, something final. Then, with a voice like fabric folding, he begins, and when the last footsteps echoed down the alley, the story stayed behind. This one takes place after everyone is gone. The stools are empty. The teacups are dry. The lamps flicker and hiss as if deciding whether to sleep or stay up. The cafe is still but not lifeless, because stories, the Hakawati says, don't leave with people. They linger in the cushions, in the grain of the tables, in the soot-blackened corners above the windows. He tells of a quiet moment, maybe tomorrow, maybe 100 years ago, when a boy sweeps the floor at closing time. His broom pushes more than dust. It stirs something. A word here, a laugh there, a memory nudging him in the back like an old uncle. The boy isn't a storyteller, but he starts humming, then whispering, then telling, and before he knows it, the stories have come back. Not from memory, from place, from the very air. Here's your final historical note. In Egyptian folk tradition, especially among rural and cafe communities, spaces were believed to hold energy, especially places of gathering and repetition. A cafe where stories were told night after night wasn't just a shop. It was a vessel, a library of breath and silence and sound. In the story, the boy doesn't tell the old tales exactly. They arrive changed, rearranged. A thief becomes a priest, a lion becomes a poem, the girl without a shadow becomes a river. But the listeners, when they return, recognize them anyway, because they don't come back for accuracy. They come back for truth. And here's your final scholarly nudge. Academics still argue whether oral storytelling can truly live in a place, or whether it's only the people who carry it. Some insist memory is rooted in minds. Others, more mystically inclined, argue that stories seed themselves in wood, in clay, in the weight of chairs. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps that's why some cafes feel different even when they're empty. The Hakawati looks around one last time. His voice is quiet now, tired but kind. The stories aren't leaving, they just know when to rest. He lifts his teacup, long since cold, and sets it back down. And then with a nod that feels more like a farewell than a goodbye, he says, "Thank you for listening." The boy beside you leans his head on your shoulder, not asleep, just at peace. Around the room, no one claps, but everyone breathes a little deeper. Outside, the wind finally stills. The moon hangs like a soft eye over the alleyway. The shadows grow round and calm. And you sit there, cup empty, heart full, wondering which story will follow you home, or which one you'll carry silently for years, until the right moment arrives to whisper it forward. Maybe tonight, maybe not. But when it comes, you'll know. And now, before you drift away completely, let the stories settle. Let the characters step back into their lantern-lit corners. Let the laughter fade into the warmth of remembered rooms. Let Cairo's night grow distant, not forgotten, just quiet. You're still sitting in that cafe in a way, the stool beneath you a little uneven, the tea cooled, the air faintly spiced with memory, and all around you silence, not empty but full of all the things we didn't quite say. Breathe in through your nose, slow. Let it out gently. These stories weren't about beginnings or endings. They were about being, about listening, remembering, feeling the old pulse of voices long gone, and knowing that some parts of you answered back. If there's a cat in the alley tonight, let it pass. If the door creaks in the dark, let it swing. And if you find yourself retelling one of these tales in a dream, don't rush. Let the words choose you. Let the silence do some of the talking. You've traveled through lantern light, steam, shadow, and myth. You've followed barefoot princes, whispering walls, silent women, jinn, and donkeys. And all along, something very old has walked beside you, just out of sight. It's still there. It always is. Good night. Sleep well. The stories will wait. They always do. End of script. Sweet dreams.